Oh my god, hey. The story I'm talking about in today's video has evolved substantially since I started making this video, and while I've been editing it, this has gone from a story about a disagreement between one show on Broadway and the New York Times critic for that show, and it's become about that show being the fastest to close on Broadway in over 2 decades. K-Pop the Musical announced last night that it would close after just 17 regular performances and 44 previews on Broadway. Now, in the background of all of this is this pre-existing outrage and drama around the New York Times review. That's what I'm going to be talking about in today's video. Now, I recently appeared on Wait in the Wings video here on YouTube, where he was discussing what defined a show as a flop. And in that video, he talked about the New York Times review still being a substantial factor in determining the success of a show or measuring a show's critical reception. And while the New York Times review is arguably not as substantial a factor as it used to be in determining the longevity and success of a show, I will leave it for you to decide whether that was a significant factor in the early closure of this show. For now, we don't know many details about why K-pop is closing early. As and when more details emerge around the closure, I will be sure to make an updated video. For now, this is what we know, so I will leave the decision up to you.
Oh my god, hey! Welcome back to my Stagey YouTube channel. If you are meeting me for the first time, hello! My name is Mickey Joe and I am obsessed with all things theatre, and this is my Stagey YouTube channel, where I review shows that I have been invited to see here in the UK as an independent professional theatre critic, and I talk about news and gossip and sometimes a little bit of drama happening in the theatre industry worldwide. So when a little bit of drama starts to go down on Broadway that very much talks about the world of theatre criticism and gets people talking about responsible theatre criticism, I'm absolutely going to notice. And in fact, today's video has been specifically requested by a few people who messaged me on social media asking me to help explain and break down everything that has happened with this particular Broadway saga. And yet, I did take pause before sitting down to film this video today. I've been ruminating on this for a couple of days because mine is not the most important voice here. I want to say straight off the bat, I am not an Asian American person. I am neither Asian nor American. I am a white British person, which makes me separate to both of those concepts. I am a critic, so I have a little bit of insight there. I am a theatre pundit here in the UK, but this is not something that is directly affecting my community, be that from a cultural or racial perspective or from a geographical perspective. This is a Broadway issue between the New York Times and Asian American theatre professionals, and specifically the company of K-Pop the Musical. So while I am going to do my best to talk through this today, I'm not here to interject my opinion and to take up any kind of space. I want to refer you to some of the brilliant takes that have already been made by Asian American professionals and by the cast of this show, and I'm going to let you know about those through the course of today's video. But I really don't want to leave a bad taste in anyone's mouth that I'm coming on here to be like, this is my opinion and you should all listen to my opinion and mine is the take that matters. I'm here to spell out what's happened and to maybe elucidate a little bit and give a teensy little bit of critical insight, but what I don't want to do is to define this situation from within the limitations of my white British perspective. But that being said, I am going to talk through this latest spat of Broadway drama. Now, if this is the first you're hearing about this, let me explain. So a new musical has just opened on Broadway called K-Pop the Musical. This had a previous off-Broadway run in 2017, and obviously now that it has opened officially on Broadway, the critics have been to see it, and there was a particular review made by Jesse Green in the New York Times that has drawn considerable ire on social media for allegedly being short-sighted, ill-conceived, and riddled with racial microaggressions. The cast have responded to this, the fans have responded to this, and the New York Times have now responded to this controversy themselves. And we're going to talk through all of it today. Now, before I get into this, if you enjoy today's video, make sure to subscribe to my Stagey YouTube channel. I talk through different Broadway drama all the time. I would talk through West End drama as well, but we seem to have less of it than the folks in New York. I don't know what that says. Honestly, I think we have West End drama, but it's not nearly as interesting. But I have various other videos here on my channel if you want to find out about the drama that happened at Funny Girl or with 1776. There are various videos that you can go and binge right now here on my channel, and make sure you subscribe so you don't miss any of the upcoming drama that we may enjoy over the next few months. I doubt it will be that long. Also, I have an exclusive offer to viewers of my videos that expires within the next few days. I'm not sure when you're exactly going to be seeing this video, but as of right now, there are 6 days left on this offer. I have a partnership with a weekly newsletter from the Broadway Maven, which lets you know about all things Broadway, and we're going to be talking a lot about Broadway in today's video. God, if I had £1 for every time I'd said the word Broadway. So there are 2 links in the description down below. One of them gives you a preview of what the weekly Substack newsletter looks like, and the other one is your link to get the offer to subscribe to it. And you can get it right now for half price, and you can get a whole year's worth of subscription in advance. I also occasionally contribute articles to that as well, so you may read my opinion pieces in it also. Now that is more than enough context. Let's talk about K-pop versus the New York Times. So I do not know very much about this show, so let's all familiarize ourselves. I'm on the website for it now. Packed with pulse-pounding new music and electrifying choreography, this original musical explores the relentless discipline, raw talent, and commercial ambition behind the international sensation. As global superstars put everything on the line for a special one-night-only concert, they face struggles both cultural and personal that threaten to dismantle one of the industry's hottest labels. Featuring a cast of K-pop and musical theatre stars, it's a multimedia experience unlike anything else on Broadway, which sounds really exciting, which sounds really current. Obviously, K-pop is this huge phenomenon. I'm sure it did not take long for commercial theatre producers to see this really popular live entertainment and think we need to be theatricalizing this in some way, because that's what commercial producers do. They take popular stuff and they turn it into money. It's like magic and capitalism. So the controversy has come with the New York Times review, and I'm going to read you some segments of this New York Times review now. So this has been written by Jesse Green, who is a white man. His byline for this says, "The worldwide sensation and American musical theatre form an awkward alliance on stage." Now, he will go on to say in this review that he really enjoyed the 2017 off-Broadway version of the show, and that's a comment I've seen actually from a few different reviewers. It's worth saying at this point, the show did not get raves across the board, and Jesse Green's was not a hugely dissenting opinion. He is not getting criticism for the fact that he was the one person who didn't like this show. He's getting criticism for the way in which his review has been written and what that indicates about issues within the critical community. But one of his big assertions here is that it just doesn't merge well with the musical theatre form and the musical theatre style. And he thinks that there ought to have been more of a fusion between the K-pop style and the American musical theatre style. He wants to see something, I think, more traditionally Broadway, more traditionally theatrical, that tells a K-pop story within normal theatrical context. He opens with a quote, "A lot of people come to these things and they don't even understand the language," says Harry, a filmmaker who passes for the villain in the noisy yet skimpy new musical K-pop. "So what are they watching for?" Good question. Now, within that opening, and this is traditional of quite a few Broadway critics, there are various barbs already, and there are various jabs at this production. He calls it noisy yet skimpy, characterizing it as overblown but cheap at the same time. He also immediately, and this is a big thing that I see from a lot of critics, questions why anyone would even want to see this show. Now, it's at this point immediately that we have to talk about a critic sort of looking at something from beyond their own limited perspective. Because I've read reviews before of grumpy, middle-aged white men who saw things here in the UK and acknowledged that the audience around them were having a great time and saying things like, "I can't imagine why," everyone seemed to be laughing. Or when I talked before about the Funny Girl reviews on here and critics attributing all of the huge audience reaction to suggesting that they must be pre-invested fans of Beanie Feldstein to even be beginning to enjoy her performance. It's hugely presumptuous and obnoxious and very self-involved to assume that yours is the only correct perspective on that show, and anyone else who is enjoying themselves more so than you are is doing so for an incorrect or contrived reason, or one that you can't possibly conceive of. If your scope of imagination is so limited you cannot begin to understand why an audience might enjoy something, then you're not doing a very good job as a critic. Because it means that your review doesn't speak to a broad range of perspectives. It speaks only to people who think exactly the same way that you do. And while I think it's good to connect with a critic as an individual, where you at home may be reading different people's opinions or listening to different people's opinions like mine, and you think, yes, that's someone whose voice I generally tend to agree with, I get where they're coming from about this, or thinking, no, I usually disagree with this person, but it's still interesting to read what they write. Anyway, there's a few critics that I feel those types of ways about. It's still good if my voice, for example, can speak to a broad range of personalities rather than being so specific. And we also have to question as well, if this seems to be his immediate opinion about the concept of a K-pop musical, not understanding why anyone would even want to go and see this, is he the right person to be sending to review this show? Now, I do think as a critic, you get all sorts of assignments. And I think after forging a career reviewing theatre, your first instinct is not going to be to question every single assignment and think, am I the right person for this? But where there is a show that you have such limited cultural overlap with, I think that's a good time to question whether you are the right person to be speaking about that show. And needless to say, the right person to be reviewing this show, in this instance, really ought to have been an Asian theatre critic. Now, whether the Asian American community is well represented enough within criticism for there to be enough Asian American theatre critics to write for all these different outlets, I do not know. I could not tell you the names of that many Asian American theatre critics because I do not know all of the different writers who there are available within the freelance talent pool in the US. I could name you a handful of critics of Asian descent based here in the UK, but I do not know that many for the US. But I suspect that there is a problem in representation there as well, and this is the result of that problem. This is where we see that issue emerging. Let's carry on with what he has said here. It's true that if you enjoy the precision-drilled dancing, meticulous melisma, and auto-tuned sentiments that have turned K-pop into a worldwide sensation over the past 10 years, you are likely to be among those cheering the musical's Broadway incarnation, which opened on Sunday at Circle in the Square. But those who aren't hardcore fans of the genre or don't understand Korean, let alone those who saw the radically different and far superior off-Broadway version in 2017, will have a harder time enjoying this one. For them, the musical is less an eye-opener than an ear-pounder, assiduously drowning out any ambitions it may once have had to be more. So again, talks about having enjoyed the 2017 off-Broadway version. Again, that's something I've heard from a few different people now. If you're curious about the differences between those and why it could be so different, I'm given to understand the off-Broadway one was a more site-specific immersive staging where the audience was led between various different rooms. It's now at the Circle in the Square Theatre on Broadway, which is a thrust stage, but even so, it's limited in terms of the venue that it's in. It can only present you one sort of thing at a time because the audience is seated and doesn't move between these different spaces. That's from my limited understanding of this show. Correct me if I'm misinterpreting that somewhere in the comments. So he goes on to talk more analytically about various different details within the show. And to his credit, he really addresses a lot of different things. And, you know, there is some very in-depth critical analysis going on here. He's talking about the narrative and the themes and the way that it positions its audience and how you're encouraged to feel as an audience. I've read a lot of negative reviews written here in London and written on Broadway that don't go into nearly this level of depth and consideration as to the relationship between a show and its audience. And he does make very frequent references to that 2017 version, so he shows an understanding of the show and its development, and often his criticisms are in comparison to that. So it's not necessarily that he is just lashing out at the concept of a K-pop musical, but sort of lamenting a superior previous version and what this could have been if it had managed to stay closer to that. When talking about the songs, he says they are all diegetic, actual numbers performed by the characters and are thus connected to the story, as in a jukebox musical, by only the feeblest of threads. He goes on to cite a specific example which for him falls disappointingly short of connecting with the character's emotional arc at that moment in the show. And then we get to the sentence that has provoked some real controversy. So Jesse Green says, "If you are not a fan, you may feel worn out by the aggressive mimicry of the K-pop performance style, not just in the mostly electronic arrangements, but also in the minutely detailed choreography by Jennifer Weber, the squint-inducing lighting by Jiyeon Chang, and the hundreds of Can You Top This costumes by Clint Ramos on Sophia Choi." And it's that comment about the lighting squint-inducing there, which has been described as a racial microaggression, or at its worst, it's been described as an out-and-out racist remark. Now, if you want a very detailed perspective on this review, I would encourage you to go to Howard Ho's Instagram. Howard Ho, if you don't know, is an amazing theatre YouTuber and musician and composer, and he's been very vocal about this as it has been occurring. If you head over to his Instagram account, which is at Howard Who, W-H-O on the end, he has posted line by line breaking down this review and explaining where he disagrees with it and where it has a limited understanding of K-pop as a genre, and where Jesse Green's descriptions of the music lack understanding of K-pop as a genre and belittle K-pop as a genre, talking about its reduced instrumentation, having only 3 instrumentalists in the band without having respect for the streamlined and efficient and very precision-made sound that they are able to achieve. Howard also takes issue with Jesse Green's description of the songs being diegetic and therefore limited. Howard points out some of the lyrics of the song that Jesse Green in particular took issue with, which was Halfway, and explains why they actually transcend being a performance within the show and do in fact speak to the character's emotional journey. He makes some really perceptive inferences throughout, and as an Asian American but also as a musician, his is a much more important perspective on this than mine. So if you head over and have a read of some of his comments, I'll tell you about another one now. The beginning, the quote that we opened with was from the one white character in the show, and Jesse Green is aligning himself with that character's perspective. He says, "This appears to demonstrate the critic's lack of understanding that the show is itself a critique of this white-centric perspective." He adds, "For the record, plenty of non-English speakers love American pop, so the question is not a good one, as the critic says." And on the squint-inducing comment, this is what Howard Ho has to say. He says, "The critic calling the lighting squint-inducing is at best insubstantial. Circle in the Square theatre is a theatre in the round, and K-pop uses it as a thrust, like I mentioned before, where it's natural for light to bleed into the audience as the audience surrounds the stage." This is very true. This is what you get in thrust lighting. If you've seen shows at Chichester Festival Theatre, or even in some stagings in the Gillian Lynn, then you will have noticed that this is just a reality of how you would light a stage like that. But at its worst, the squint-inducing term is offensive, racialized language which is carelessly used in a show featuring a mostly AAPI cast and used to describe the work of an AAPI lighting designer. Given the recent rise of anti-AAPI attacks, this radicalized term has no place in this article. The New York Times should at the very least retract this language. Now, if I'm being completely honest here, I do not know Jesse Green personally, so I cannot speak to his particular motivations behind using this language. But upon reading it, it doesn't come across as a deliberate racial comment. I think the way it's been extrapolated online, because I've seen a lot of people tweeting about being outraged that New York Times could use a comment like squinty-eyed or slanty-eyed, and that is very much not what is being said. He describes the lighting as squint-inducing. What I think it was is incredibly careless, and I think it perhaps could have been an unintentional racial microaggression. It remains a racial microaggression, where the way that it's positioned, the way that it's talking about the work of an Asian American lighting designer in an Asian American show with an Asian American cast. Obviously, it's just an incredibly careless and thoughtless and needlessly provocative thing to say, but I cannot speak to, and none of us can speak to, the intention behind it. Doesn't stop it being a racial microaggression, but I do think it's more of a clumsiness than anything else. But here's the thing, is that also doesn't make it okay, and it shouldn't stop the New York Times from issuing an apology for that particular remark. Where I think it probably came from is just a grumpy critic not having a particularly good time at a show, and because of where he's sat, you know, he's not enjoying it, he's like, ugh, this is loud, I'm not having a good time, there's light in my eyes. You're looking for things to comment about at that point. When you really dislike something and they're just piling on and they're adding jabs. I've read it plenty of times. I've even experienced it a couple of times myself, where I think low mood in a show and taking issue with something else about the show sort of unfairly colours your perspective on all of the other creative elements. And it stops you from being able to review it perhaps reasonably, with an understanding of the fact that in the circle and the square, you're going to have light bleeding into areas of the audience. Now, K-pop responded to this with an open letter to the New York Times, and I'm going to read some of that to you now. So they write, "We are writing to ask that you issue an apology to the cast and creators of our show for the insensitive and frankly offensive review by Jesse Green. To be clear, we respect Mr. Green's right to be critical of the show. What we are asking you to address is the cultural insensitivity, underlying ignorance of and distaste for K-pop as a genre, and what comes across as casual racism in his review. That this would be the case in the New York Times is, frankly, astonishing. Using squint-inducing to describe the work of a Korean lighting designer, whatever the author's intent, is a particularly egregious example. Beyond specific words, Mr. Green's view that if you don't understand Korean, you'll have a harder time enjoying this show is simply not borne out by the audience reaction he himself witnessed, and is demonstrated in several of the comments now appended to the review. In fact, only a small fraction of the dialogue is in Korean, and the meaning is generally comprehensible in the specific context, which he surely knows. The comment smacks of a dog whistle. Is a Broadway show valid only if it is centered on and catering exclusively to a white English-speaking audience? Which again takes us back to who ought to be reviewing this show. If this show is not, you know, determined specifically for a white audience in mind, if that is not the principal person who ought to be enjoying the show, not that this show isn't for everyone, but it's not like this is a show for white people, which, I mean, should anything be a show for white people? But if it's not centered around a white English-speaking audience, should we be considering more carefully the critics who ought to be reviewing it? The answer is, of course, yes. Yes, we should. And they go on to say a lot more. They say the job of theatre critics is to dissect, analyse, and ultimately judge a work. We also contend that they have a responsibility to meet a show on its own terms and to be informed enough to know what that even means. I mean, again, what Howard Ho has indicated on his Instagram page seems to speak to a lack of understanding from Jesse Green on the nuances and the intricacies of K-pop as a genre, and that suggests a certain lack of qualification in being able to review K-pop the musical. By calling this out, we hope to challenge the Times, your writers and readers, and ourselves as well, to think critically about the language we use and to be ever mindful of bias, unconscious and otherwise, which I think would be a great development for everyone involved, rather than a simple accusation of racism to an individual. I think this can speak to a broader growth of understanding and a learning opportunity. Now, I was reading about this on Playbill the other day, and I can't find the exact quote of the section that it was, but they made an excellent comparison between Jesse Green's review of K-pop and finding the use of Korean dialogue to be exclusionary with his review of the Yiddish language production of Fiddler on the Roof, which I believe he said something like it really heightened the atmosphere of it all. He was very positive about the use of Yiddish language. Now, a difference between the two is that Fiddler on the Roof did have super titles to translate the Yiddish language in the show, but according to the producers, the Korean is used infrequently in K-pop the musical. But it does seem to be telling that he should react to those uses of language in such different ways. And on the face of it, it does seem to be this cultural and racial difference between the two that perhaps has motivated that. Again, I'm not going to attempt to speak to individual motivations, but that does seem to be quite a telling contrast. Now, after a few days of statements and social media reactions, and radio silence from Jesse Green, who has made his Twitter account private, the New York Times has responded to this. So Green himself has declined to comment, but has referred inquirers to the Times' PR representatives. And what they said is this: "We saw the open letter written about the Times' review of K-pop and quickly convened a discussion among editors and members of our standards department. This group was in agreement that Jesse's review was fair. More importantly, we wholly disagree with the argument that Jesse's criticism is somehow racist. We always welcome feedback and reaction to our journalism and have conveyed a similar reply to the producers who wrote the open letter." Now, I find this to be a little bit frustrating because it shows so little understanding. Even that one in sentence, the squint-inducing remark, is a careless one and one that can cause offence. And that doesn't necessarily dictate that offence was intended, but when people are all reacting a certain way, you have to listen to that community, you have to listen to that reaction, and you have to be open to that. I think it's really important for us to be able to have an important dialogue like this. You have to be open to hearing other perspectives on these issues. It would have cost them nothing whatsoever to retract that particular description of lighting. But instead, what they say is, "We disagree with the argument that Jesse's criticism is somehow racist." And that shows just such a lack of effort to participate in this conversation. When they're saying somehow racist, they're acting as if the whole thing is completely contrived and attempting to gain no understanding of the concept of microaggressions and what has been said in this instance. And while I do think that social media has perhaps unfairly extrapolated this remark, I also think that there is a huge responsibility of the Times here to be more responsive to the outrage that has happened. You know, this hasn't come from nowhere. So what can we gain from all of this, and what can we learn from all of this? And what does this teach us about responsible theatre criticism? I think for a long time now, we've needed more diversity within theatre criticism. We advocate a lot for diversity on stage and diversity of writers and directors and where you can really see it. But if the people who, because the New York Times is very influential as a paper, if the people who get to decide how successful a show is going to be with their artistic conclusion of it, if they are the ones who get to dictate whether or not something is good and they get to speak to the public opinion and dictate the extent to which people are going to buy tickets, I think there's a responsibility for them to have some diversity as well. I think we need to be representative of a broad range of cultures and a broad range of insights, and that's diversity in every way you can conceive of. Diversity where you have younger critics as well. And it's fair to say I've experienced more than a little bit of reluctance from older critics to accept my perspective as being at all valid or something that anyone would even be interested in. But that's a story that's been put to bed. Why is a lot of criticism still as male-dominated as it is? Why do we not have more female voices within theatre criticism? There are some really great ones here in the UK and some high up places, which is fantastic, but we really ought to be seeing equality across the sector. And also, when trans characters and trans narratives and trans problems are included and represented and quite often, frankly, commodified in a lot of contemporary plays and musicals, we need to have more trans and non-binary critics represented. We need those voices to be uplifted. One of my very good friends here in the UK, Ellie Talks Theatre, who is also on YouTube, and I will put a link to her channel down below. She's one of the few trans critics here in the UK that comes to mind. Christian Lewis is a brilliant non-binary critic writing on Broadway, and the value of their voices is considerable just for their talent, but also because of the scarcity of that kind of important trans and non-binary representation. This is really a long time coming on my channel, but I could refer you to a bunch of important voices here on YouTube, because if you're coming here to see me, then presumably you enjoy listening to this kind of analysis and listening to theatre criticism and watching theatre criticism on this kind of a platform. So if you're not following my good friend Ellie Talks Theatre, I would implore you to go and give her channel some love as well. She covers a lot of shows that I don't have the chance to get to, and she has a really important perspective, a different perspective to mine quite often. We do not always agree on things. So go and check out her channel if you like mine, and please do subscribe. Now, I've spoken a fair amount about this. Like I said, I think the most important perspectives on this are from the Asian American community. I think they have much more insight into this. They are going to be much more affected by this situation. And while I'm happy to say a little bit of my piece on it and hopefully explain to you what has happened here, I would love it if you would go and further your understanding of this situation by listening to some of their perspectives. And then, as always, I would love to hear your thoughts about this in the comment section down below as well, especially if you are a member of the Asian American community, or if you're a K-pop fan, or if you have any kind of specific insight into this situation and into this show. I would love to hear from you. So let me know all your thoughts about K-pop versus the New York Times in the comments section down below. Thank you so much for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed my latest Broadway drama recap, analysis, and explanation. If you did, make sure to subscribe to my Stagey YouTube channel. Like I told you at the beginning, I make these videos all the time. I make so much Stagey content here on YouTube. There's plenty for you to go and enjoy. So make sure you've subscribed and you don't miss any. Also, if you really enjoyed today's video, you can use the super thanks button down below to give me a Stagey tip. That very much helps me to be able to make as much regular content as I do. But as a reminder, completely your choice. I know these are very trying times for everyone. I hope that everyone is staying safe and that you have a stagey day.
For 10 more seconds, I'm Mickey Joe Theatre. Oh my god, hey. Thanks for watching, have a stagey day. Subscribe!